The Convoy is a feature of Fire Emblem that I have often taken for granted. It's just the place that holds your items. It's really easy to stick in the back of your mind and not think about much. That's why when Hamlo in my Discord server suggested this topic, my initial thought was, how many different ways has Fire Emblem even done the Convoy? The answer is actually quite a few, and while it can be subtle, it often does impact how each game plays out. So let's take a look at how each Fire Emblem has handled the Convoy, and how it impacts the gameplay. We'll be going a little out of release order in this video so that we can talk about related Convoy systems together. However, as is typical, we will be starting with Fire Emblem 1. In FE1, the Convoy is handled in a fairly unique way. Many maps just have a Convoy tile, which looks like a little tent, and any unit can access the Convoy by going to that tile. Some maps will even have multiple, such as Chapter 8, which has a Convoy near the shops at the beginning of the map, and another one near the boss at the end of the map. This setup makes inventory management easier while you do your shopping, and then when you get to the boss, who is an armor knight, the Convoy there gives you a chance to pull out any effective weapons you might want to use against him. Having a Convoy near where you start, or near shops, is helpful because FE1 doesn't allow you to manage inventories during preparations, so the Convoy allows you to make sure your units are all outfitted the way you want them to be before you send them off to battle. This is especially helpful since trading is a little janky in this game, in that units can only give each other items and not take an item back, so one unit can't trade into another unit if that unit has a full inventory. The Convoy allows you to manage a unit's inventory in a more flexible way, even if their inventory is full. The stationary nature of the Convoy tiles also ensures that you need to lock into your inventory decisions a little bit. Whatever gear your units have at the beginning of a map is the gear they are going to be stuck with for most of it. If you leave the Rider's Bane in the Convoy, you will not be able to just grab it when the horse reinforcements show up later on most maps. Still, even stationary Convoys allow for more flexibility than no Convoy at all, especially in a game that doesn't have a robust prep screen. In addition to be able to grab items mid-map, a stationary Convoy also allows you to do things like Convoy warps to get items from far away. For example, you could have a unit put an item in one Convoy on a map and then another unit take that item out from another Convoy on the same map, functionally teleporting the item from Convoy 1 to Convoy 2. Cool. This type of manipulation is possible with almost any version of the Convoy, and it becomes more powerful of an option the more flexible and mobile the Convoy is. Another quirk of FE1's Convoy is that it has a pretty tight item limit of 40 items, so you will want to make sure you are clearing it out of things like low durability weapons or old, weaker weapons that you don't need anymore. It also charges you 10 gold per item deposited, but that's basically negligible. Convoy costs haven't really been explored again in mainline Fire Emblem, and while I wouldn't want to add it to any of the existing games, a game more focused on inventory management might make good use of something like a Convoy cost, provided it was more than an irrelevant charge of 10 gold. Narratively, the Convoy being a stationary tent that starts near where we do makes a lot of sense. The second Convoy on a map often makes less sense. It's reasonable that Marth's army has a supply tent, and that it would start near where our army does. But why do we have a second Convoy tent behind enemy lines on so many maps? It's not a big issue, but it does feel a little narratively odd. This Convoy system wasn't reused much in the rest of the series, but rather was iterated upon. The most similar game is Fire Emblem 5, which also has on-map stationary convoys, but some important differences are that you can actually organize items in the prep screen before each battle, so having a convoy on every map isn't as essential. This is good because another difference is that a lot of maps just don't have a convoy tile. Instead, they tend to appear on either maps where you need to do a lot of inventory management, such as Chapter 6 when you've just escaped capture, or on maps with shops. I like that Thracia withholds on-map convoys from you when it doesn't make sense, because it ties in well with the game's ethos of strongly attaching the narrative to the gameplay. When you're in prison, you don't get access to a convoy on the map, and that makes sense. Other than that, there's nothing too crazy about Thracia's system, it's just a nice iteration on FE1's, with item management being available in preps now. The next most similar convoy system is in Fire Emblem 7. In that game, pretty early in the game, you recruit a merchant named Merlinus who acts as your convoy. He's recruited in a pretty difficult to miss Gaiden chapter, but if you do miss it, it delays him joining by a few chapters. Like in Fire Emblem 1, on each map where you deploy Merlinus, he sets up a tent near where you start, and that allows you to access your convoy. There are a few immediate differences though. First, you can choose not to deploy Merlinus, although there's rarely a reason to, as he does not take up a deployment slot. Second, his tent can be accessed by units next to it, compared to FE1 where the unit has to stand on the convoy space to access it, so it makes it a little easier to have multiple units access the convoy in a single turn. Third, Merlinus actually has stats. Though he doesn't move and he doesn't take a deployment slot, enemies can still attack him and even prioritize doing so. If he dies, nothing is lost. You just can't access the convoy for the rest of the map, but you'll be able to deploy him again next map and get access to the convoy again. Still, if you know you're going to want access to your convoy, it's a good idea to leave a unit behind to protect him. This ensures that you will always have access to your items and you won't have to drop any treasure you pick up. It's also often just good experience for the unit you leave behind who gets to beat up some chumps that want to attack Merlinus. Plus, some units even have supports with Merlinus, which can be pretty funny, if not super important mechanically. If you do protect Merlinus for the duration of a map, he gains 1 level for each map he survives, and when he hits level 20, he promotes and gets a wagon. The wagon functions exactly like the tent, except it can move. Obviously, this makes Merlinus a much better convoy. He can deliver supplies right to the front lines instead of needing a unit to ferry supplies around, and you don't have to leave someone behind to guard him because you can move him along with your army and maneuver him away from danger as you need to. But Merlinus' unique traits also become more useful when he can move. He can still be attacked, but he also doesn't die permanently when his HP hits 0. So in a pinch, you can have Merlinus bait an attack or wall off an enemy and not worry about him dying. Plus, he doesn't even take a deployment slot, so it's kind of like having a free unit that plays on casual mode, but can't attack. And you can find uses for that sometimes. I like Merlinus a little better than FE1's version of the convoy. Attaching a character to the tent is fun, and having to have a unit protect him adds a little more decision-making to Merlinus. It's not really a big deal to have him die, so if you feel like you can complete a map fast, or you just don't care about getting to his promotion as fast as possible, it is okay not to protect him. But on the other hand, if you're going a little slower, or you do want to make sure he promotes, or you feel like you need his convoy access for the full duration of a map, then you often need to leave someone behind. This is most interesting in the early game when strong units are a little hard to come by, because any unit you leave with Merlinus is a unit that could have been helping you actually complete the map. On the other hand, they'll also get a bunch of experience, so that's nice for whoever you leave on convoy duty. That Merlinus can promote is a fun reward for protecting him, and I actually really like that he has supports. Him being an actual character and that there's only ever one of him on a map makes him feel more narratively satisfying than something like FE1's Convoy, and also explains why he's on every map. It's because he's traveling with you. There's not really anything wrong with a convoy that is purely mechanically driven. That's going to be most of the convoys in this video, but I like that FE7 made the convoy a character. In the FE7 ROM hack, The Last Promise, there is no convoy Gaiden chapter, and you instead wait until chapter 17 to get a convoy. This is when you would get Merlinus in FE7 if you missed the Gaiden. And man, it is really rough having to drop excess items in those early chapters, so I'm glad Fire Emblem games tend to give you the convoy early, and around when more items and treasures start showing up. Getting back to Merlinus though, FE7 is not the first game he appeared in. He was also present in Fire Emblem 6, which takes place in the same world as 7, but several years in the future. In this game, Merlinus is already promoted. Your units are spared the indignity of having to protect the tent, and instead we have our wagon convoy right off the bat. He also arrives earlier in the game, joining you as early as Chapter 1. Like FE7, he has stats and plays on casual mode, but there are some important differences. One is that he actually takes up a deployment slot, and 2 is that he doesn't just level up by surviving. Instead, he can only gain experience by being attacked, which gains him 1 EXP per battle. I actually like that Merlinus takes up a deployment slot. A moving convoy that doesn't permanently die is useful, and I don't mind the idea of having to choose whether or not you want that utility over another staffer, combat unit, or utility unit. Especially since FE6 deployment limits often don't feel quite as strict as FE7, so it's a little easier to find a spot for him if you feel like you need a convoy for a map. I do wish he still leveled up by surviving maps though. It doesn't really matter, but I thought it was fun for Merlinus to level up in 7, and it's pretty rare for him to level up in Fire Emblem 6. The only downside of him being deployable is that it really does suck playing without a convoy on any map where you don't deploy him. You have to drop items if your inventory is full, you can't access any items that you left behind in the convoy during the map, And on one hand, this does make inventory management more challenging and require a little more intentionality. You need to think about your preps. But it's also annoying. I wonder if there could be a compromise where deploying him gets you a wagon, but if you don't deploy him, you still get the stationary tent. The tent is so much more limited than the wagon, so there would still be incentive to deploy Merlinus sometimes, but I wouldn't be miserable on maps where I leave him on the bench and accidentally open a chest or kill an enemy that drops an item with a full inventory unit. This is a cool Merlinus overall, though. I think he works nicely in FE6. And I like the tension between deploying him or a unit that can contribute in more traditional ways. But I definitely understand why they changed him in 7, a game that is a little bit tighter on deployment at times, and seems designed in a way that is meant to be a little more forgiving to the player, and thus may not want the player to be without a convoy. I think it's interesting in both 7 and 6 to have exactly one character that doesn't permadie, and I think there's some space to play around with that more. It's not something that FE experiments with much, usually all your units permadie or none of them do, but there's lots of things you could try. You could have a convoy that can't permadie, but whenever it does die, it costs you money. You could have a combat unit that doesn't permadie and see how that feels. The closest I can think of to that in the games I've played is that there is a Myrmidon in Tearing Saga with a PRF sword that brings him back to life if he dies. It makes him the most exciting Myrmidon in that game and allows you to use him in different, more aggressive ways. I've seen some ROM hacks or fan games include items that bring a unit back to life on death too, but it's something FE hasn't touched too much outside of the occasional revival shrine or staff, and I hope they play around with it more in the future. Put in someone with a 9 lives skill that can die 9 times a playthrough or something. Okay, permadeath tangent aside, Merlinus is really cool. Between his aversion to dying, his FE6 deployment slot, and his FE7 promotion, he feels like a very unique take on the Convoy, which is a system that can sometimes feel samey from game to game, especially in the more recent entries in the series. So I really like Merlinus. And I also really like my geckos and skinks on Patreon. Special thanks to all the geckos and skinks, and a shout out to my super skink Lonely Voxel, along with the other skinks Marms, Shake Her Hand, Nepsit, Muted Miami, The Noodle Doodler, Doopy, Stars to Art, Wingman, Upscale Furry Trash, Lonely Voxel, Cosplay Sylveon, Aikipoo, Lucy Sev, Emma, Aaron Gaiden, and Red Mage Morgan. If you want to get early access to videos, the occasional Patreon exclusive video, or just want to support the channel, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the video description. Alright, now that I put all the geckos and skinks back in the convoy, let's move on to Fire Emblem Gaiden. Gaiden has its own convoy system, and it was sort of reused in its remake, Echoes, but with some changes. In Gaiden, you have 2 separate convoys, one for Alm's army and one for Celica's. You can sometimes swap items from one army to the other via limited-use couriers that appear in some villages, and unlike Fire Emblem 1, you can do item management outside of battles in this game. But the trade-off is that there's no access to your convoy during maps. This makes Gaiden one of the most restrictive games in terms of on-map inventory management, because units can only hold 1 item each. So if you have a dozen units, you only have room to bring a dozen items on each map, versus each character being able to carry a handful of items in FE1. The effect of no on-map convoy combined with small inventories is that you need to be a little more thoughtful and deliberate with your item choices in Gaiden, because once you start a map, you are stuck with the items you chose. Though Gaiden does also allow you to retreat from maps, so if you feel like you made an inventory mistake, you can always do a retreat, have another look at your inventory, and then try again. The convoy being split between your 2 armies and having limited opportunities to swap between them is my favorite part of the system. These trades across convoys feel really meaningful because you don't get many. Sending an item from one army to the other might mean you won't get that item back to its original army for a while, if ever. This can make each run play a little differently, and the game isn't so difficult that you feel like a bad trade across armies is going to ruin you. This makes for an impactful system that even as a first-time player, I felt comfortable experimenting with. The Tellius games work pretty similarly to Gaiden, where you can only access the convoy in between chapters, though those games do give units more inventory slots, so you don't feel as limited on what items you can bring to a map in those games as you do in Gaiden. Radiant Dawn is the most comparable to Gaiden because it has different armies with different inventories. While there are no couriers that let you swap items from army to army, you do have units that appear in multiple armies and can be used to transfer items from one to the next. Famously, Ileana starts in the Dawn Brigade, and then reappears in the Grail Mercenaries. So you can give her items in Part 1 that you want her to send over to the Grail Mercenaries in Part 3. This is a pretty cool system on subsequent playthroughs, but it can be awkward on your first playthrough because you don't really know who's going to end up in what army. And while you may think that you can predict it, it's risky to do so. It's reasonable to suspect that Ileana will return to the Grail Mercenaries at some point, but you might also think the same thing of someone like Tormod in Part 1, and he doesn't reappear until the very end of the game. So on your first playthrough, this is pretty difficult to work with, but on subsequent playthroughs, it's fun. Gaiden's remake, Fire Emblem Echoes, keeps much of its convoy system the same, but with the major change that you can access the convoy during the map via either Celica or Alm. While this does take away a little bit of the weight from inventory management before maps, it also allows for new strategies involving swapping items around in a way that is more freeform than it was in Gaiden. In a game where you can just retreat off of maps to reorganize inventories anyway, I prefer Echo's choice to allow you to access the convoy during each map. Echo's system is essentially the series standard these days, with lords acting as your on-map access to your convoy. But the first game to do this was one of my favorites, Fire Emblem 3. This game works much in the same way Echoes does, except without the split armies. You have a convoy which can be accessed during preps or during a map by having Marth or a unit beside Marth use the convoy command. This is the most powerful version of the convoy. Much like FE6 Merlinus, Marth acts as a moving convoy, allowing him to deliver items or perform convoy warps. But he never takes a deployment slot, and while he doesn't play on casual mode like Merlinus, it's a given that he won't die since that would force a reset. So it's not possible to permanently lose him outside of an Iron Man, where you can permanently lose him, but that means restarting the whole game anyway. The only downside of this version of the convoy versus Merlinus is that Marth has stuff to do like be at objectives and seize thrones, so Marth, your convoy, needs to be heading towards these objectives if you want to complete them, whereas Merlinus could run over to side objectives with other units while the rest of your army heads towards the main objective. So it's a little less flexible, but I think the Lord being your convoy is generally stronger than the convoy being a tent for half the game in FE7, or taking a deployment slot in FE6. This system of the Lord being the convoy, or a minor variation of it, is also used in Sacred Stones, Shadow Dragon, New Mystery of the Emblem, Awakening, Fates, Shadows of Valentia, Three Houses, and Engage. The main difference between each game is just whether the convoy has an item limit, and the traits of the character with convoy access. In Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, for example, Marth is footlocked, can't class change, and is pretty frail, especially on higher difficulties. This can limit his ability to position aggressively, even compared to someone like himself in FE3. In contrast, a lord like Corrin in Fire Emblem Fates can be much more flexible than Shadow Dragon Marth, both in the early game with the extra bulk from the Dragonstone that allows for easier positioning, and later game depending on what build you go with for them. Plus, even if you didn't use Corrin for some reason, you can still have them close to the front lines but out of danger by utilizing pair-up, while Shadow Dragon Marth does not have that option. Even the types of objectives on each map can change the dynamic of how Lord Convoy access plays out. In Shadow Dragon, Marth has to be at every objective, and this influences where he, and thus the convoy, are going to be positioned. In contrast, Awakening has no main objectives that have to be completed by Chrom, so if you want the convoy to be somewhere on a map that isn't near an objective, it's often not an issue to send Chrom to that section of the map. Abundant movement options can also help with this. Chrom can be ferried around using pair-up and viable rescue staves that make it really easy to move him around, and thus your convoy can get from point A to point B very easily. The biggest contrast to this is FE12's harder difficulties, where there is no rescue command, no warp, and a limited amount of uses of the rescue staff, so you probably don't want to spend them on convoying. The last big difference between all the lords that act as convoys is whether or not they can reclass and how many weapons they can use. This is relevant because reclassing allows you to do things like gain mobility or bulk that allow you to position a unit more freely, and if your unit can use a lot of weapons, they tend to get more value out of having the convoy. In a game where you feel like your lord is fine to just carry one weapon and a vulnerary, the convoy gets a little less value because you can just throw that on them at the beginning of the map and they'll be good to go. But if your lord can use multiple weapons, they might want to switch more often and may want to carry more than 5 items. Imagine something like Great Knight Corrin. They would have access to 3 different weapon types, so being able to grab whatever weapon is most useful out of the convoy is helpful. You don't have to choose between filling your last inventory slot with a hand axe, or an effective weapon, or a javelin, or a vulnerary. You can just pick whichever one you need out of the convoy when you need it. This also goes for staff users. I love making a Lear a staff user in Fire Emblem Engage, and part of that is because they can always pull whatever random utility staff I want out of the convoy. This is different than other staffers where I need to think about what staves they're going to need during preps, and which ones are okay to leave behind, or else they're going to have to visit a Lear for the convoy. Basically, a moving convoy can open up some flexibility for you, and the more items your units might want to use, the stronger a convoy is. As an extension of this, I think convoy access tends to be a stronger feature in more difficult games. In FE8, I pretty rarely need to use my convoy. It's usually sufficient to just load your best unit up on hand axes and javelins and let them cook. And if you make a convoying mistake, it's usually not that big of a deal. This can be true in more difficult games as well, but I find myself using the on-map convoy more often in games where I am inclined to want to grab a healing item, or switch which staves my sage has, or pull out a hammer to kill a knight when my javelin won't cut it. In general, convoy access seems like a bit of an underrated feature of the characters that have it to me. It's not brought up too often in discussion of them, and maybe that's because in a lot of cases good planning can reduce the need for convoying. In my pre-planned run of Awakening, I pretty rarely convoy on the map. But the further I go into fuck it we ball territory while I'm playing, the more useful convoy access is, and I do think that should count for something. There's one more FE game with a different convoy system, and that's Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. This game has an odd little inventory system that I love so much that I made a whole video on it, which I'll link in the video description. The TLDR though is that every unit has their own inventory, their own money, and their own convoy. To swap items between units, you have to sell the item to the pawn shop on the first unit, and then have the other unit buy it for twice the amount you sold it for. This applies a cost to trading, and makes gold an important resource for building a strong unit. Going into the nuances of this system is beyond the scope of this video though, I'm just going to talk about the convoy. And fortunately for the length of this video, the FE4 convoy is pretty straightforward. You can only access it via castles, and units can only access items in their own convoy. Like previous games with stationary convoys, this means you have to commit a bit more strongly to the item choices that you make, since it can be a while before you get a chance to adjust them. The commitment is even a little harsher in this game because there's no trading. In something like FE7, even on maps where Merlinus is stationary, you can still have a unit carry around items to trade to another unit. If someone like Sarah is only using heal, she can carry around a hand axe and a vulnerary to pass to Marcus later. Alternatively, a high move unit like Florina can ferry items from the convoy to units further away. This isn't the case in Fire Emblem 4. When you leave the castle, you are stuck with the items you grabbed until that unit returns to the castle or visits a new one. A funny thing about units having their own convoy is that it really makes you realize which units you're using the most. At the end of a playthrough of Generation 1, Sigurd and Dizel's convoys often have a handful of items in them, because I'm constantly killing enemies with those two, visiting villages with them, and buying them good items from my other units. Meanwhile, my poor other units are left with barren inventories and empty convoys. Poor fellas. At least they're usually rich from selling all the good stuff to my favorites. 50,000 gold will go a long way towards Arden's peaceful retirement. That should get him a nice wedding, a nice house, and then he can even invite the other Gen 1 units over for a barbecue. Tired joke aside, the FE4 convoy system is one of the less interesting ones. It is totally functional, but the game's core inventory and buying and selling features are what add all the wrinkles and nuance to FE4's item management. But that's okay. When you do something crazy with the rest of the inventory system, I can live with the convoy being more of a support unit. We love support units here. That's all of the convoy systems in mainline vanilla Fire Emblem, but there are 2 additional examples I want to touch on before wrapping up. The first is Engage's Enchanter class, which can be unlocked by completing the Fel Xenologue DLC. A quirk of this class is that it gives any unit in it access to the convoy, which is otherwise only available to a Lear. This alone I think is cool. Convoy access is a meaningful ability that has generally been limited to lords. Why not experiment with it on more units? It's a perfect fit for something like the Merchant class in Fates, and it could even be a good personal skill for whatever the next version of Anna we get is. However, that is not the only cool thing about the Enchanter. They also get a skill called Enchant. This skill allows the Enchanter to use an item to apply a buff or effect to themselves and allies around them. Some of these effects are pretty simple and what you might expect from the item. If you use a vulnerary, you heal yourself and all adjacent allies for 15 HP. But some of them are more interesting. Using a strength tonic halves weapon weight of adjacent allies for a turn while also buffing their strength. Enchanters can even use a weapon to buff units wielding that same weapon, so if you're using a bunch of Thunder Tomes on your team, you can give them all a little boost with your Enchanter. The key here is that there are a ton of different buffing options for Enchanters to choose from, but all of them require a specific item to apply a specific effect. Convoy access goes hand in hand here, allowing you to always get what you need. All of this combines to make a really fun and unique utility unit, and one that I wish was in the main game, instead of locked behind playing the Felzino log. Another game that includes a non-Lord Convoy option is the ROM hack Dream of 5. Not that far into this hack yet, but one of the units you get pretty early, Trisha, really jumped out at me. She has the Henchwoman class, and her introduction mentions how she always seems to be right behind you with exactly what you need. The way this is represented in the game is that she has the convoy and swap commands. So even if she's weaker than my other units, she has a unique role to play on the team, and I think that's cool. Trisha in Dream of 5 and the Enchanter class in Engage are perfect examples of why I want Fire Emblem to experiment more with the Convoy command. Outside of Engage's DLC, Convoys have been pretty stagnant in how they've been designed, working basically the same way in each game for the last decade or so. There is something to be said for if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and I don't think there's anything wrong with Convoys, per se, but I think there's so much more room for creativity. Units that have unique uses for items like the Enchanter, units who specialize in inventory management in a game where that's a little more emphasized. Maybe everybody could get Convoy access, but there could be a cost associated to using it. So many different ideas that could be tried. Even something as simple as Merlinus' wagon can add some flavor and sauce to a mechanic that has become a little repetitive. So it's something that I hope they play around with more moving forward, because inventory management is a fun part of Fire Emblem for me, and I love when there are new ways to explore that. But what's your favorite convoy system, and how would you like to see the mechanic explored in the future? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video and want to see more like it, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so you never miss an upload. Either way, thanks for hanging out, and have yourself a lovely week.